Good morning, everybody. Welcome to day 2 of the Afrofuturism Conference, which is part of the Zora Neale Hurston Festival of the Arts and Humanities. This is year 2 of a 5-year cycle devoted to an exploration of Afrofuturism, and our theme is Afrofuturism, What is its Sound? My name is Scott French. I am chair of the Zora Neale Hurston Academics Committee, and I am also an associate director of the Center for Humanities and Digital Research at the University of Central Florida, which is sponsoring this 2-day event. I'd like to thank all of the program support staff from the University of Central Florida's History Department who are here with us today, and also Preserve Eatonville Community, which is the institution behind this wonderful event. And this conference is part of a much larger month-long celebration of Zora Neale Hurston, and I encourage you to visit the Zora Festival website for all of the details. Before I introduce the moderator for today's panel, I wanted to let you know that you will be invited to contribute questions through the chat. And we'll also have a small live audience, limited seating audience here at UCF downtown. And my colleague, Dr. Trent Tomengo, will be here. He's a professor of humanities at Seminole State University. He will be sort of facilitating conversation from this end. And Dr. Clarissa West-White from Bethune-Cookman University, who you'll meet in a moment, will be facilitating the conversation among the panelists and with the web chat. So with that, I'd like to turn things over to Dr. West-White and welcome all of you, and thank you all for joining us today.
Good morning. And as Dr. French mentioned, welcome to day 2 of the Afrofuturism Conference, where this morning we will spend the next 2 hours addressing the question, what is the sound of Afrofuturism? Joining us today are Doctors Regina Bradley of Kennesaw State University, Julian Chambliss, Michigan State University, Paul Ortiz, University of Florida, Erik Steinskog, University of Copenhagen, Toniesha Taylor, Texas Southern University. Before delving into the question of the moment, I would like to share brief biographical information, research bios for each of the panelists, and highlight their intersectionality of their scholarship. Basically explain why this body of excellent researchers and scholars were chosen. Dr. Regina Bradley is a writer and researcher of African-American life and culture with an emphasis on the contemporary American South. She is an alumna Nasser Jones Hip Hop Fellow and is an associate professor of English and African Diaspora Studies at Kennesaw State University in Kennesaw, Georgia. Her expertise and research interests include 20th and 21st century African-American literature, hip hop culture, race in the contemporary US South, and sound studies. Forthcoming works include chronicling Stankonia, the rise of the hip hop South, and a collection of essays about Outkast. She is the founder and host of Outkast Conversations. Dr. Julian Chambliss is professor of English with an appointment in history and the Val Berriman Curator of History at the MSU Museum at Michigan State University. He is co-director for the Department of English, Digital Humanities, and Literary Cognition Lab, and a core participant in the MSU College of Arts and Letters Consortium for Critical Diversity in a Digital Age Research. His research interests focus on race, culture, and power in real and imagined spaces. An interdisciplinary scholar, he has designed museum exhibitions, curated art shows, and created public history projects that trace community, ideology, and power in the United States. Dr. Paul Ortiz received his Ph.D. in history from Duke University in 2000. He is the author of an African-American and Latinx history of the United States, Emancipation Betrayed, the hidden history of Black organizing and white violence in Florida from Reconstruction to the bloody election of 1920, which received the Harry T. and Harriet V. Moore Book Prize from the Florida Historical Society and the Florida Institute of Technology. He co-edited and conducted oral history interviews for the book Remembering Jim Crow: African Americans Tell About Life in the Segregated South. He is a third-generation military veteran and a first-generation university graduate. He has spent years organizing work with the United Farm Workers, the Farm Labor Organizing Committee, AFSCME, and many other unions. Dr. Erik Steinskog received his Ph.D. in musicology for the Norwegian University of Science and Technology in Trondheim, Norway. His research focuses on Afrofuturism, African American music, and questions about music, race, gender, and sexuality. Recent publications include Afrofuturism and Black Sound Studies, Culture, Technology, and Things to Come, Electric Affinities, Jimi Hendrix, Richard Wagner, and the Thingness of Sound, Metropolis 2.0, Janelle Monáe's Recycling of French Slang. On the Other Side of Time, Afrofuturism and the Sounds of the Future, Performing Race and Render, Erykah Badu, Between Post-Sound and Afrofuturism, and Analog Girl in a Digital World, Erykah Badu's Vocal Negotiations of the Human. And finally, Dr. Toniesha Taylor received her Ph.D. in Communication Studies from Bowling Green State University in 2007. Her primary research agenda focuses on African American oral and rhetorical history and digital humanities. Her most recent publications on Afrofuturism include We Speak, We Make, We Tinker, Afrofuturism as Applied Digital Humanities, and a review of Afrofuturism 2.0, The Rise of Astro-Blackness. Other published works include Pedagogies of Race, Digital Humanities in the Age of Ferguson, and forthcoming essays in the Digital Black Atlantic and Digital Pedagogy in the Humanities, Concepts, Models, and Experiments. Audience members, you are in for a treat. And without further ado, we will begin by asking the most appropriate question. It is a multi-part question to get our juices flowing. First, what is Afrofuturism for those who may be joining us this year, who did not join us this time last year to embark on this journey? And then what is meant by the sound of Afrofuturism? And is it possible to capture a definitive definition of its sound?
Julian, that's all you, dog.
I knew that was going to happen. What is Afrofuturism? Well, I think the definition that I lean on is that Afrofuturism is an intersection between the speculative and the liberatory. And in that regard, I think Afrofuturist practice is one that seeks to decenter European constructs and elevate alternative frameworks rooted in an African cultural, African diasporic root system, right? So this is a way of us thinking about it as a counter narrative to the established narratives around modernity, which are rooted in European exploitation and transformation as we associate with the age of discovery onward. But it's also a celebration of a kind of systemic cultural linkage that we can trace back through the descendants of Africans who were brought into the New World. So as many people define Afrofuturism, thinking of it as epistemology, a way of thinking, a way of doing, I think that definition of it in opposition is really an important one for a lot of people. But I do think there's an affirmation there also in that definition related to this idea of seeking freedom, because that has always been a primary concern for people of African descent, especially in terms of like the Western experience. The sound of Afrofuturism, I think, is perhaps one of the most important questions that we can ask, in part because it weaves together different modes of production, cultural production, that we can see throughout time. I think most of the time when people define Afrofuturism, they tend to do so strictly thinking about the future. i.e. science fiction. So if you joined us last year, they tended to, the literary legacy around Afrofuturism is one defined at some level by science fiction works, published works. The problem with that, of course, is that Afrofuturism sort of exists whenever Black people exist. So in the past, Black people thought about the future and they thought about freedom, but they didn't necessarily use a framework of science fiction that we associate with the traditional definition of Afrofuturism that was coined in the 1990s. So the sound of Afrofuturism really encompasses all those ways that African Americans or people of African descent might articulate out in the world a vision of freedom. It could be oratory, to me. It could be music that is liberatory. It could be things that we have not yet heard. So it's, I think, one of the things that is the most accessible narratives of Afrofuturism, however, and I think that's one of the reasons that it is something that many people who are listening to these conversations this year have already heard, but did not immediately identify it as such.
Dr. Bradley, what are your thoughts about the sound of Afrofuturism? And are you all okay if I use first names?
Yeah, I'm fine with that.
Okay,
Gina's
thank
fine.
you.
Yeah, so good morning, everybody. How do I define Afrofuturism? Okay, so I feel like I have to give disclaimers first. Pretty much every answer I'm going to give today is based on being in the South. Every single answer. I am from Southwest Georgia. I'm a Georgia girl. I'm a rural Georgia girl. So immediately when I think of Zora Neale Hurston, I think of her as the patron saint of country Black girls everywhere. Like, I love her. Everybody's like, she does this for the world. I'm like, I really don't care what she does for the world. As a Southern Black woman, she made it possible for me to speak to these experiences and root myself in a particular trajectory that folks either wish didn't exist or want to pretend like it doesn't exist. So there's that part of it. In terms of thinking about Afrofuturism, sonically, the Afrofuturist sound is rooted in the South, period. And what I mean by that is, if you think about from a musical standpoint, from Negro spirituals to funk music in particular to hip hop, you know what I'm saying? All of it is rooted in what Julian was saying, this idea of liberation. And that idea of liberation isn't necessarily to escape, but more so maybe provide a blueprint for the possibilities of what the futurity can look like when it's not from a traumatic, marginalized, victimized perspective. So when I think about articulations of sound, I think there's a couple of things that are going on. The first thing being, it is an intentional and calculated archive of experiences that have been pushed to the side in favor of something that's usually more digestible, something that is easily accessed. Because let's face it, I mean, if you think about Southern Blackness, especially Southern liberation, folks go to the Civil Rights Movement, which is fine, but that is the only blueprint in place to think about what liberation looks like. And that's problematic for those of us who came after the Civil Rights Movement, who came before the Civil Rights Movement, because the reality of it is we're all still in conversation with each other. So I feel like Afrofuturism is an opportunity for us to have, multiple stakes in the past and the future in order to get a better footing in the present, because of the speculative possibilities of what that looks like, especially when I think about, hip hop as a sonic archive of Southernness. So when you think about folks from Ghetto Boys to Outkast, especially the Dungeon Family and their connection to the funk scene, and that in particular George Clinton and P-Funk in Parliament, the idea of not presenting a pristine futurity, I think, is equally as important to thinking about the idea of Afrofuturism. It's not a sanitized experience. It's more so the opportunity to open the door to have conversations about what the messiness and the jankiness even of what these Black experiences are, and how they create to this particular type of work and experience.
Wonderful. Erik, I know looking at the titles of some of your publications, what are your thoughts about a definition of a sound of Afrofuturism?
Yeah, I'll give it a shot. I tried to write a book about it, and I don't think I managed to answer those questions easily. Uh, but I also need to make the caveat, of course, because as a white Scandinavian trying to interrogate this music, there's some definitions that are not necessarily mine to make. So I'm trying to be careful. I mean, I want my scholarly prose to be precise, but I don't want to sort of speak on behalf of someone I'm not. So in that sense, what I try to do is to read up on Black critical thinking to help me to see how the community is defining Afrofuturism, and then relate that to my own scholarly field, which is the music and the sound of it. But of course, I cannot stop quite there because, as I said, I also have to try to write about it, and I'm I'm intrigued by what, for example, Alondra Nelson writes in her piece for Social Text in 2002, when she said that it's about Afrofuturism is broadly defined as other stories uh, from the African community about culture, technology, and things to come. I mean, that's the phrase I've sampled as the subtitle of my book as well. And I think that that is broad enough that a lot of things can fit into the definition, but it still points to some key issues to think about. And it's the cultural communal dimension, it's the technological dimension, and it's the focus on what is to come that is some kind of future. And for me, and it's not necessarily idiosyncratic, but it's based on basic obsessions. For me, it all starts with Sun Ra. And it starts with Sun Ra playing music with texts like the joy of the sound of joy is enlightenment on the one hand, and tracks like there are other worlds they have not told you about, to tracks like space is the place. And this whole narrative about other worlds they have not told you about tells me, okay, but why are these other worlds not told about? Well, it's because of contextual dimensions. It's because of power. It's about suppression. It's about getting these alternative, these counter stories, as Julian was saying, into the open in one way or another. And I think music is a perfect vehicle for alternative histories, because so much of historical thinking has been focused on language. And of course, that's also part of my scholarly self. I want to see how sounds contribute to establishing community, how sound contributes to let us move out of our bodies and to have exalted experiences, whether we are dancing or being in church. To me, that's basically the same. It's the kind of music and community pointing us, showing us way to those other worlds they have not told you about. And that is also the liberatory dimension. So I'm perfectly in agreement with my co-panelists about the speculative / spiritual dimension, the communal dimension, and what I'm also intrigued by, and you could see that on, I mean, it was way too kind of you to say all those publications, but I've been interested in trying to think, how do we conceptualize sounds that have not existed yet? How is the future even possible to think sonically? I mean, if we watch sci-fi movies, we can see how they are trying to sort of find fashion that could be fashion in the 21st century or something, more or less successful, but it's intriguing. But that whole kind of thinking about what is the music of the future, that intrigues me, because the musicians, composers that have tried to do that, they have combined new instruments like synthesizers, for example, to try to make sounds that might be new-ish when they appear, but they are still sort of dated. I mean, if you remember and I've taken a more mainstream sci-fi movie, just an example. If you remember the soundtrack to the Blade Runner movie, it sounds really, really 80-ish now. Even the pictures could be kind of futuristic, but the sounds are really backwards. And I'm intrigued there by British Ghanaian scholar Kodu Eshin, who writes, the sound of the future is always beatless. That there is no drums, there is no rhythm in the future. And I think that is one of the things that at least Afrofuturism tells us about. Of course, the future is groovy, but how is it groovy? What is these rhythms that go back in time and into the future, and how are we to think about those sounds? That's where I am currently when to your questions.
Paul or Toniesha, did you have comments before? I didn't want to ignore a voice. And I can go on. I know that silence. I'm good. And so the important.
I think Paul wanted to say something actually.
Oh, I have a particular question for him, so I'm coming to him. So I just don't want people to sit idle thinking, you know, I can just kind of, no. So a general question, I think, you know, every time for scholars, you know, everyone I'm sure sat with their major professor and they came up with that question after you gave them what you thought you were going to do your research on, and they went, okay, so who cares about this? Why does it matter? And that's your elevator pitch that you must be able to answer. So why is it important as of 2021 that we have this conversation about the sound, the sonic, the speculative nature of Afrofuturism?
Well, you know, if I could respond to that, you know, I guess growing up, I was born in 1964, and as a young boy, you know, I love science fiction and post-apocalyptic literature and things like that. But, you know, we have been living in the apocalypse now, actually this entire century. You know, the United States has decided to pursue a death path, you know, endless wars, Hurricane Katrina, the disastrous response to the pandemic. We've been killing ourselves, or the society's been killing us, right? As peoples. I think of, and because I'm a field worker and I was trained, you know, I remember going out into the field, into the Mississippi Delta, the Arkansas Delta in the summer of 1994, and bringing mules and men with me, and learning how not to talk, because that's all scholars learn how to do, right? Grad seminars, talk, but listening. And I think the sound of Afrofuturism, I was just so excited to hear Dr. Bradley talk about the Ghetto Boys, because this is a great example of a sound that is so current now. So when I was a kid, I can vaguely remember when The World is a Ghetto came out by War. And I remember the elders around me loved that album. Man, they play World is a Ghetto over and over and over again, you know, and it's really become my favorite, one of my favorite albums. And in 1996, you know, going forward, Ghetto Boys do an incredible cover of The World is a Ghetto. And I want to urge everyone to watch the video that they produced along with that, because that footage is taken in neighborhoods, Black and brown neighborhoods in Houston, where my father and his generation grew up, you know, over policed, tough working class neighborhoods that Hurston would have been at home in. She would have reveled. Here's a quote by Zora Neale Hurston I want to share with everyone. And this will make everyone now uncomfortable. She says that the man in the gutter is the God maker, the creator of everything that lasts. The man in the gutter, imagine that. But when the Ghetto Boys filmed that video in what we call Old Fourth Ward and Fifth Ward of Houston, Texas, this is what they were trying to present, is the culture that existed that people try to shut themselves off from, but that they made. The world is a ghetto, right? The ghetto doesn't just accidentally spring into existence, it's created, it's made. And you can connect James Baldwin and his writings about growing up in Harlem, with Houston, with living in the South, and the world that we're in now. You know, when I walk through downtown Gainesville, silence. It's the sound now in some parts of town. Fear. No one wants to go outside. And then you go into the frat area, and everyone's outside, not wearing a mask. not caring about who they're giving the virus to, a death culture. And so this is why the question you posed is more important than ever. And I kind of, what would Zora Neale Hurston say? She'd have her notepad, she'd be listening, she'd be talking with people. Great question.
Yeah, I agree. So for me as a communication scholar, I'm always interested in, when I think about sound, I'm also always thinking about communication, like what are people talking about? And how are people creating meaning through the way that they have conversations or not have conversations? I think this kind of ties into something that has stayed with me from yesterday that Julian asked about the sound, right? And about silence as well, right? So how do we do meaning making in this process? And I think that for me, one of the things about the sound of Afrofuturism is also about the meaning making process of Afrofuturism, right? How do we make it make sense to ourselves, to each other, to other people in the community? And I think that's where I think we probably don't have enough answers. But I think the reason why we don't have enough answers is also because we don't have enough people asking the question, right? And so we're still trying to figure out what the sound is. I also think to some degree, once we kind of get a definition of it, it'll shift anyway. And so the thing that we need to be comfortable with is that just because you have a definition today doesn't mean you'll have a definition tomorrow. Because there'll be new inventions and new ways forward. And as I talked yesterday about sort of the future past, the sound, that's what sound is, right? That it's always moving. And we're always reinventing it because every new conversation is a new opportunity for meaning creation.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to what Toniesha said about this idea of world building and kind of thinking about past and future. I feel like the reason that sound is so significant now is because a lot of the truths that we're hesitant or don't want to confront are sonic. Like you can't, it's not necessarily staining folks' reality with sound, but I mean, there are a lot of things that folks can't say out loud that sound can do for us, or silence or quiet. I'm thinking about, Kevin Kwashi, the sovereignty of quiet in this instance. Because one of the things I think about in particular is considering the very rife social climate that we're in, racial social climate that we're in. A lot of the things that Black folks feel like we can't say is grounded in quiet or silence, but that doesn't mean that we haven't forgotten. It doesn't mean that it's forgiveness. Like I think that there is this, kind of strong held belief that when Black folks go quiet, that means that all is forgiven and that we've forgotten. And that's far from the truth. Like I think it was Chris Rock who had a joke. It was like the most racist person on the planet is an old Black man. Like if you ever talk, like he'll be talking and he'll be saying all this stuff, like this. And then as soon as somebody white comes by, he goes quiet and he goes not necessarily into a submissive mode, but his whole demeanor changes. And as soon as they're out of earshot, you see that crack over there, he didn't even say good morning. Like I think it's important to kind of think about sound as a Rosetta Stone almost to speak to those illegible feelings that Black folks can't perform out in public in fear of retaliation. So going back to what Paul was talking about, the world is a ghetto. You put that in conversation with something like my mind's playing tricks on me, and just kind of thinking about what that riff looks like. So all those mental anxieties that they were talking about, they were speaking to them, but it was the actual accompaniment, the actual sound itself. I'm also thinking about somebody like, over in Memphis, like 3 6 Mafia and DJ Paul, like the way that they utilize the horrorcore elements, right, to kind of speak to these very real anxieties and racial horrors that we hear about. And even just to the point where to get the hell out of here. I'll be like, just the idea of sound as a form, not necessarily a form of escapism because it's woe is me, but we need a break. Like we need a second to actually sit and let me think through this. And if there's no language to articulate what those thoughts are openly and publicly, then sound is definitely the way to do that. And that changes, you know what I'm saying? And music is the best way to think about that. So if we're thinking about, you know, again, going back to this idea of like Negro spirituals, you know, folks are talking about, this is how I'm going to emancipate myself. This is how I'm going to get to freedom, right? Like hidden in plain sight, right? Like, okay, so, you know, we're going to follow the drinking gourd. We're going to talk to Moses. Folks thinking they talking about Exodus. No. They talking about Harriet Tubman going to be at this spot at this time when the moon is this way. It's time to ride, right? And then it gets discovered or co-opted in a way, right? And it's like, oh no, it's just beautiful struggle music. And I'm like, no, that actually came from a serious struggle. Like this was working music, you know what I'm saying? So when I think about Zora Neale Hurston, especially the work she did with the WPA, and then her, you know, her actually putting herself in these particular places, it's not that she wants to document it so it can go on a shelf. Like, I think that's the one thing that I really wish that folks will understand about sound, particularly Black sound, is that it's not something that is you put into a museum because it's nice. It's actually still doing work. It's continuously doing work to decipher these particular experiences. And you get the same thing, you know, you get to funk and you get to hip hop. And then when hip hop really takes root in these different places outside of New York, folks really see the work that hip hop is doing in terms of addressing, you know, this idea of oppression and marginalization. And now we're in this instance where we're in a digital era and everything is accessible and everything is available. But what are folks doing to actually articulate these frustrations? They're using sound, whether it's wailing, whether it's quiet. Thinking about trap in particular, you know, trap sound might have started here, but now it's international, you know what I'm saying? And, you know, even like a friend of mine sent me something that like Tibetan monks have trap music. Y'all know that? Like there are monks who are making trap music. It's crazy, right? Folks who are Chinese are making trap music. Like they're taking that particular sound, but what's crazy is that the further it goes away from the origin point of being quote unquote, you know, Black sound, shout out to Dr. Matthew Morrison, right? This idea of Black sound, it doesn't take away from the significance of what that Blackness suggests, symbolizes, signifies upon, because it becomes a useful tool for folks to speak to particular experiences that are otherwise washed out, right? So I guess the other part of that thing that I would add to that is the danger of sound being used to wash out particular experiences because, you know, you just happen to like it or it makes you move, you know what I'm saying? Like thinking about Greg Tate, and he's like, you know, when white folks take on white music or Black music, it's everything but the burden. Like it's nice. I can sing all of Yo Gotti, I can sing all of these things, you know what I'm saying? But as soon as it actually comes time for you to literally say Black Lives Matter, well, no, all lives matter. You know what I'm saying? I'm like, that's not what the intent was. That's how you want to encourage it. So I don't know. I just feel like it's a tug and pull between this idea of guilt and expression of marginalization that sound does, and they're held in tension with each other. And this has been something since, you know, sound has been recognized as such. So
yeah, I really want to think about this idea that there's a technology represented by sound, and what's especially in our contemporary moment, as Paul and everyone's alluded to, you know, how do you empower communities under stress globally, or this idea that Afrofuturism in particular has these very strong Southern roots, I think is a really important one to think about, because at some level in the American context, the South is the problem, even though like from a scholarly context, we know that ain't true. like it's like the most racist place in America is like Chicago on a Sunday afternoon, right? Like, so it's not the South that's the problem. It's at some level like an American problem around race. But if we're talking about who needs to vision a future more, who needs to vision a future more consistently, yeah, people in the South are always envisioning that and negotiating the reality of trying to achieve that. And so, you know, one of the things about sound as a technology is that it is a consistent tool that's accessible to all people, all Black people. And it's, you know, and it's a really portable tool. And so this idea of like sound as a kind of, you know, the creation of a counter-public space, like a Black counter-public space that's accessible to every generation, no matter where they are, no matter whatever the circumstance, becomes really important, because I think one of the things that we all continue scholars of all stripes continue to like are try to articulate is how are you supposed to organize people to push towards a better tomorrow? I mean, even in terms of like the last election, this was not a there was basically, it was word of mouth. You know, at the end of the day, it was like people talking to people why you got like people coming out to vote. I mean, it wasn't targeted ads. I mean, yes, it is, but at some very basic level, it's the sound of people like talking. You know, the community having a kind of like network of knowledge that really was the difference between success and failure. And so, like, sound as a technology, a Black liberatory technology, is a really interesting way to understand its persistence in a kind of global experience.
And I think to kind of tag onto that too, I think about sort of the way that we sort of commute and communicate, right? So I grew up in the Bay Area, and I think about like all of the people who would share their like homemade mixtapes and how we would share particular kinds of sounds when you went down south to visit your cousins or back east, or, you know, friends and family who would go to Hawaii, would go to the Philippines, right, to visit their cousins there, and they would take this sound with them, right? And so, and then talk about like the things that are happening, you know, at home in California are also happening in these other places, and people could, you know, share not just a struggle, but share a conversation about liberation, right? And that's part of how we do this. And I think that that's something that, as we started talking about this, is so central to the way that we understand Afrofuturism, is that idea that the day that we stop imagining ourselves in the future is the day that we die, right? Like, that's the end of freedom. And so it seems to be like this internal thing that we know we can never do. Like, I don't care what happens on Earth, I can't stop imagining a future moment, because the second that happens, the second we stop doing that, the second we stop talking about that, is the second that it's all over. Like, it doesn't matter whatever else happened, it's over now, right? And it seems like that kind of core understanding is something that's so important, that we hear in all of our music, that we see in Zora Neale Hurston's writing, that we see imagined all around us, right? Like, I think that's my favorite thing about Negro spirituals and emancipation songs, right? And I had a moment in grad school where, like Regina was saying, somebody was like, oh, it's just lovely music. And I'm like, nah, that's a map, yo. Like, nobody wants to get lost on the way to freedom. Like, that sucks. Who are you gonna stop and ask directions from? The slave catcher? Like, this is not how any of this actually goes down. Like, you know, and who's trying to be out here mistaking the tree? Like, no, you're waiting. It's like waiting for the wrong bus. Like, nobody wants that, right? Because everybody else is gone and you're the last one standing around. And then it's like, I always imagine that first there was like probably also this one person who was like always in fear, like, I cannot be left on this plantation when everybody else is gone, because y'all ain't gonna ask me what happened. Bump that, nah, right? And so I think that there's something about the way that we imagine the future that's still that moment, right? We still all are a little bit that ancestor that's like, I will not be standing here. I will not be the only one standing here. That is not how this is gonna go down. I will not be responsible. I will not be the one who has to try and figure it out. Like, nope, I'm leaving with everybody else. And so staying in that space is really important, I think.
Okay. You've caused me to do some mixing and scratching of my own over here with my questions, because between all the 4 or 5 of you. You've touched on so many questions I had coming, but I think I'm trying to remix so that it kind of makes sense. So I recall an assignment I used in middle school to show students how the youth drive language and vocabulary. And students had to come up with a novel word, vocabulary word. And they had to use their influence to see how quickly they could get that word used around campus. And so, that would show not only that they are the creator of the dictionary and not that the dictionary is the creator of language. How do you think sound and Afrofuturism in the age of social media reach our youth? And how can scholars like yourselves bridge that theoretical gap between what scholars do in their corners of academia versus what our youth do in the garages and basements and street corners, so that they have a firmer grasp, or maybe just the vocabulary to take what they're doing forward?
I mean, off the rip, the first thing I think about is not to discount their genius. Like, I think one of the challenges is when we think about youth culture is, oh, it's just the kid, I'm country, so it's like churn being churn. You know what I'm saying? But it's something, I have to remind myself as a scholar, yeah, I am traditionally, conditioned, traditionally trained. But you have these kids out here without any of that, who don't need any of that traditional training, describing to a particular, subset of genius. And I'm like, yep, that's it. I mean, the digital era and younger folks have just been so innovative. I think that's the other part of it too, is that, sound doesn't have the same boundaries that the academy has. Like, there's so many boundaries in the academy that it either burns you out or kicks you out, especially if you're not supposed to be in the academy. Like, I'm not supposed to be in the academy. I'm pretty sure a lot of my other panelists are like, I'm not supposed to be in the academy either, considering, background, right? Like, country Black girl from Southwest Georgia, not supposed to be a Ph.D. in African-American lit, teaching at an R2 institution. You know what I'm saying? But I also think that when I come into contact with students who came up the same way I did, and sometimes worse than I did, when they share, is that for me, it's important for scholars and instructors and trainers to make safe space so that students and youth can show you what their genius looks like, because usually it's not legible to an academic discipline. You know what I'm saying? So I'm thinking about social media. I'm thinking about TikTok in particular. Like, TikTok is, I'm sorry to say it, TikTok, is me being academic, has tore some shit up. Like, Generation Z has used TikTok like, well, we not gonna do, my parents are racist, their parents was racist. In addition to a lot of the fun stuff. Like, I just really wish that a lot of academics would understand, like, you can walk and chew gum, you can dance and have a good time and still be critical. And the younger folks are showing us that, like, okay, so I'm going to give you this criticism of, white supremacy with whoever in the background playing, you know what I'm saying? Or joking about it, or having, joyful moments. And I think that's what's so significant about thinking about this through a lens of Zora Neale Hurston, is that she made room for joy to be critical. You know what I'm saying? Folks having a good time wasn't lack of critical engagement. You know what I mean? And I feel like that's the same thing that applies to a lot of youth culture now, a lot of youth sounds and language, is that it exists within a joyous space. And it's not that it's the language or the actions that are illegible to people, it's the joy that these kids use to articulate the criticism that is illegible. So I think that that's important to think about moving forward, is, we can't mute what that creative process looks like, because muting the actual creativity just to get to the meat or to the marrow, you know what I'm saying, discounts the brilliance behind why that criticism even exists in the first place.
Paul, I noticed you're unmuted. Were you going to say?
Oh, you know, I was just thinking about another song which, you know, has a lot of meaning, you know, in terms of the conversation we're having right now. You know, the youth are getting restless. And I'm thinking about that as Regina was talking. And one of the things that young people know today is that the society doesn't work. The society that we're living in just doesn't work. And as much as academics, and see, our job as academics, by the way, is to try to train people, teach people, and convince people the society does work, right? But it doesn't work. This is one of the things I think that makes Zora Neale Hurston so more important than ever. I mean, if there's one book I would put in people's hands right now to read, it would be Their Eyes Are Watching God. Because Hurston, and I'll just kind of preview what I'll be talking about this afternoon, she takes us to those places that have, you know, as Dr. Bradley was saying, this incredible joy, but at the same time, sorrow. And she takes us to places where if you really want to figure out why the society is not working, what better place than Lake Okeechobee in 1928? The Okeechobee hurricane, which kills now, I mean, the latest estimates I've seen upwards of 3,000 people, primarily African Americans, migrant workers primarily. Now it's interesting, thinking of Afrofuturism, the Okeechobee hurricane is known as the Katrina of its time. That's an interesting commentary because both Okeechobee hurricane and Katrina were not natural disasters. They were man-made, American-made disasters that primarily impacted African Americans and working class people. And so when we think about the youth are getting restless now, increasingly, you know, young people are kind of returning to these critiques, and now they're using new technology to try to figure out the world around them. Black Lives Matter has been said now that it's the largest social movement in US American history. And there's a reason for that. It is just, you know, colleagues in Lagos, Nigeria, were telling me that they're like, yeah, the Black Lives Matter protests in Nigeria are just incredible. And they're rooted, you know, they start in the US, but, you know, we have these problems with police and military brutality in our country that resonate with our youth. And as soon as they heard about Black Lives Matter, they're like, this is it. You know, this speaks to what we're doing now. And of course, that's communicated. You know, we mentioned earlier TikTok, which to be honest, I've never used, right? But I think about, the last thing I'll mention is I think about a place like Baltimore and what was the TikTok of 1796 when Black sailors disembarked from a ship from the French West Indies in 1796 and start running into enslaved African Americans, and they start saying, you know, there's a revolution going on. The youth are getting restless in Haiti, and stuff's going down, and this is it. This is our time. There was no CNN back in 1796 to to block that message, to say that what was happening in Saint-Domingue was a race riot, right? Because those Black sailors were telling people in the port of Baltimore, this is a revolution that's going on. This is the end times. This is the day of Jubilee, right? And so Baltimore, which is ground zero for the slave trade, also becomes the foundation stone of their Underground Railroad. And there's a reason for that. I mean, back then, if they would have had these types of techniques, but again, it's how do you, I guess, I mean, the last thing I'll say in this is, how do youth continue to use social media in a way to promote liberation, it's a challenge. You know, I talk to my students and they're like, you know, the alt-right runs circles around us with social media. And we need to understand that people who would oppress us and keep us in ghettos or barrios are the masters of social media right now. They're in Silicon Valley. They're coming up with new apps. Right now at UF, we had, some of you may have heard about the crime app used against grad students and faculty teaching, right? And so if you have an instructor who supposedly is not teaching face-to-face and risking their health to do so during the time of the global pandemic, oh, you can just do the crime app and the report will go directly to the administration. So I think as we think about technology and social media, we think about the liberation, the ways that we can find liberation through practice liberation, but also equally so is the techniques of oppression and control, which are being used, through social media. Sorry, I got a little disjointed about that.
No, you did a great job. And you actually helped springboard yourself into a question that was designed somewhat for you, but also with Dr. Bradley in mind about the South, because some of your writing, could be the sound of the South and of the oppressed, and that these sounds reverberate and manifest differently in different locales, especially when we talk about advocacy and protest. How do you situate yourselves to hear and then to tell such stories when the people who are best suited to tell it don't have access or feel they don't have an invitation to do so?
Honestly, that's probably one of the biggest fears I have about chronicling Stankonia is is that I am speaking to experiences that there are other folks who can speak to the experience that much better. It's made me confront that I have, a particular type of privilege as an academic because, oh, she has a PhD, so she has the right to speak about Southern rap. It's not that I get to speak about Southern rap because I've been listening to it for damn near my whole life, or that it was my first introduction to contemporary Southern Blackness. It's her name is Dr. Regina Bradley, and that is what makes her relevant. And that's not right. You know what I'm saying? I think one of the reasons that it took me so long to finish this damn book is because I was constantly going back and forth about, am I the right one to speak this particular truth? You know what I'm saying? And one of the ways that I've eased that is talking to people who actually not necessarily were on the ground, but had a much more in-depth investment in why Southern rap does what it does, and being able to speak with them about my ideas and my theories, and that was useful. So I feel like because I'm in a particular place of privilege, it is my responsibility now to make room for those folks to actually speak their own experiences and speak their own truths, which I think is so important, especially as it comes to the South, because there's this expectation or understanding of Southernness as universally white, and that ain't it. Because universally white Southernness is acceptable and folks know how it turns, and you know what I'm saying? And I'm like, what makes people uncomfortable is the reality that, one, Southernness is not monolithic. The way that I came up in Southwest Georgia is different than the way that somebody came up in Mississippi, is different than somebody who came up in Eatonville. You know what I'm saying? So that makes folks uncomfortable that there is no universal Black Southern experience. There's threads that connect us together, but it's not universal. The second thing is that there is still a very in-depth anxiety and bias that Southern Black people are backwards and innate and only think about things through the lens of trauma and victimization and all. And I'm just like, that's not the case. And it really throws people off when folks realize that white people are not the center of Southern Black people and Southern brown people's experiences. Like, I'm like, yeah, y'all are there, but y'all aren't the focal point. And that's what throws folks off. And I think being able to disrupt that standardized and sanitized narrative that Southernness is, you know, if it happens to Southern white people, then that's the way that all Southerners feel about it. It's kind of like what's going on right now as a Georgian, and we got to deal with, you know, the foolishness that is Marjorie Taylor Greene, and folks are like, well, you Georgians, and I'm like, hold up, no, she ain't no kin to me. You know, so she ain't no kin to me. She don't speak for me. Being able to recognize that, and folks recognize that even within the state, there are different experiences. North Florida is totally different than Southern Florida, who's pulling from the Caribbean. You know what I'm saying? And Clarissa, you probably feel like, because you have Bethune-Cookman, you can see it, you know, in the same way that Atlanta is only Atlanta. It is not OTP outside the perimeter. So I think that it's important to recognize that being able to make room for those multiple truths, multiple interventions, and multiple experiences is important. And sound is a way to do that. And getting folks to understand that sound is more than just language, how I'm talking to you. Sound is also the non-musical cues, the non-linguistic cues, the sighs, the wails, the moans, the hums, the laughs. All of these things are important to thinking about how to complicate these particular types of experiences. But being able to utilize those, being able to utilize the academic training as well as just the training of living, like just living it, is important to being able to complicate these experiences.
You know, I think oh, go ahead, Julian.
I just wanted to emphasize the point. Like, I think one of the things that the Hurston Festival as a space for exploration in this cycle around Afrofuturism, there is a real challenge here that I'm always trying to think of about this question of the outside and the inside. You know, at its very core, this is, for academic speaking terms, a public humanities project. At least that's how I think of it, right? So the goal here is to try to translate what is essentially like a really abstract thing into a thing that people will understand. Not because that, quite frankly, has a lot of value in academia. It don't. That's the truth. It don't. I mean, I can work the system, but I'm gonna be honest with you. There's a limited amount of like treasure in that endeavor. However, if we're successful in even a little bit of a way, it means that people on the outside can make that academic system work a little bit better, because they can see like, well, this is where I need to be intervening. Like institutionally, this is where I need to be thinking about. And the sort of the battle for the future is right now, right? It's a little bit, it's always a little bit about the past, you know, the colonization or decolonization of the past. It's always about right now, because right now, as almost all the theorists will talk about, it's about this industry of predicting the future. Like the systems that we have right now are the systems that are, for the people in power, these are the right systems. For people not in power, for all the people who are like turning something like Afrofuturism, they're the wrong system. And so this legitimacy question that we vie in the public sphere around, as Paul says, like the people on the right have created an alternative ecosystem of information, of knowledge, of institutions. That's why we can't even agree on what the truth is, right? Because they have a totally different system they have created. That system tells them the thing that we know ain't true is true, right? So you're not going to be able to convince them. You need to have a vigorous ecosystem of information that right now exists, but it exists in this sort of like communal structure that is sort of sound. It is these sort of indigenous, inherent, like, you know, ancestral communal structures. So how do you formalize? How do you bridge that gap? Like, how do you move from the outside to the inside, right? How do you break into the system? And it's understanding, at least in a little way, this sort of mediation around what, you know, what we're talking about as Afrofuturism as a system, as a set of knowledge, that does affect you, that you are contributing to that, right? Like this is not simply an abstraction. You're doing it. Can you find your way to this conversation, right? Like this is a mediation space, and always I think our hope is that in having that mediation, that we're better equipping the next generation of students or the next, you know, community members to be engaged in those vital conversations, right? In those institutions, asking the right questions about how you're doing X, Y, and Z.
Okay, thank you very much. Paul, did you were going to say something? Are you holding it or?
Oh, you know, we were talking, you know, something just occurred to me. I've not heard, you know, even the ardent proponents and champions of American exceptionalism, and that's still what we're trained to do, you know, certainly as historians, even the most ardent ones have not made the claim that the 21st century is the American century. Because they know better, you know, they'd like it to be different, but they're like, wow, you know, we've just screwed up over and over and over again. By we, I mean people in power and then their spokespeople. And so again, this kind of brings me back to, because we're doing a lot of code switching and moving forward and backwards in time to the Great Depression, when Zora Neale Hurston is doing so much of her work but also in the 20s, you could argue that the South is already in the Great Depression, really in the 1920s when Hurston is beginning her incredible field work. And I think one of the things that I try to do now with my students but also working with, you know, communities outside of the university that I teach at, is really just trying to teach, and I'll talk about this a little bit this afternoon, is, I mean, how do you model the behaviors of like listening and humility and empathy and joy, you know, that are, again, none of those things are really like, we didn't sit around in grad seminars, whatever our discipline was, learning about humility, you know, or joy or empathy or all these kind of joyous things that Hurston talks about. None of us were told, hey, you go to Central Florida, you may want to wear a pistol. And that's exactly what Zora Neale Hurston did, right? For good reasons, okay? So a lot of things are just off, you know, forbidden to talk about. But I think one of the things that I'm trying to do is encourage people to just like shut up for a moment and listen. And that, and again, when I think of, you know, Hurston's work and just that great generation of ethnographers and folklorists, they had been humbled the way that we're humbled now. There's no way you can claim this is the American century. Stop trying to do that. Stop trying to prop up a system that doesn't work. I mean, Julian was mentioning this earlier. Why would you want to go back to normal? All these people saying, well, now, you know, Trump lost the election. Now we can go back to normal. What the hell does that mean? Oh my God. Don't go back to normal. And so, but to avoid that continued, you know, you know, it's like, yeah, I love to read apocalyptic literature, you know, and I love Blade Runner and all that, and Aliens reboot and stuff, but like, I don't like living in real life, kind of. I mean, can we stop? You know, so let's try something else, man.
Great points. Toniesha and Erik, I know you also teach graduate, undergraduate students. What are you hearing from them about, sound, or when you discuss these issues, do they have particular concerns, or are they kind of just rolling with it?
Oh, they're not rolling with it. Not my students. I teach at HBCU. Are you kidding? They, I think the thing that I enjoy about sitting back and listening to them and their experiences. Last semester, I taught an undergraduate course that I'm now going to be teaching every fall, studies in urban rhetoric. And the thing that that was really interesting was when I brought into them Cardi B, like the day before, had like this whole political launch on, why folks need to vote, and why, if you don't vote, you're just giving up what tiny little portion of power you actually have. And it's not enough to vote, but you have to be informed. Like, and she, in her classic sort of Cardi B way and her Cardi B language, was like, if y'all don't pick up a pamphlet and read something, like, it's just not going. And she was clicking her nails and her tongue at the same time. And I was like, I am in love with this moment. This is everything I want in the world, right? But we're teaching in a pandemic, so I can't have the kind of conversation in my classroom that I want to have, but I still wanted to have it, right? Because I knew that they all saw it, right? They all saw that, and that same day, dropped a campaign by strippers and exotic dancers about going to vote, right? And going to the poll and working the poll. And that's what the campaign was called, right? And I was like, yes, for all of this right here. I am so happy, right? And I brought it into the Zoom classroom where my students are all very tired and nobody had their cameras on. And so I was like, it's all right, don't worry about it. This is what we're gonna watch. So I showed them the Cardi B video and then the poll, work in the poll campaign video. I have 25 people in my class. 25 people clicked on cameras, right? All of a sudden, everybody was like, wait, hold on. First of all, my professor just showed us a stripper video in class. Right? Because for some of them, it was the first time they had seen the campaign. But it was a great moment because this was a conversation that they were all already having. And one of my students said, wait, is this what communication is about? Is this what scholarship is about? And I said, yes, it is. And another student said, wait, hold on. So I can write my paper for this class about that? I was like, yeah. And matter of fact, go talk to somebody about it and then report that. And this is how you do that, right? And so because part of that class is also teaching methods, right? Critical methods of rhetorical analysis. And it's an intro class, it's a 200 level class. And so having them have a moment where they see themselves in their own community in the classroom as knowledge creators, not as a data point, right? But as knowledge creators, was something that for a lot of them had never happened before. They thought that they were important for themselves, but they didn't understand themselves as important as knowledge creators and people who are making decisions about the way that Blackness should function. And it was probably the best moment in class. And I am happy to say that those campers, most of them did stay on the rest of the semester. Not all of them, but most of them. But it was a moment where they realized that the things that they were talking about that they thought were sort of like private Black conversations were actually knowledge producing conversations that made sense in a place of knowledge creation, right? And that I think is the moment that I think is important to have now, where we bring those moments into the classroom and say, we know that you're having conversations about this because I'm having conversations about this, about how this isn't working and I don't like it and I want it to be different, right? And we can actually make it different here if we start with the fact that this is a valid piece of knowledge creation and go from there.
Yeah, my experience. I mean, I teach in a musicology program, but as already said, I'm doing it in Copenhagen, Denmark. Of course, it's quite different, and at the same time, I'm kind of a historian of music, so I also teach a lot of what has happened in music for the last 60, 70 years. I was hired, my position was music after the invention of the gramophone. So those 150 years are more or less my period. And I had a class on modernism in the fall, and I'm happy, and was actually teaching on campus in the fall. But we're going online again now, so I'm starting to teach on Monday, and I have 2 disco and dance music classes going on now. So sometimes the music is within what we've been talking about now. Sometimes it's broader into it. But what I need to do, I mean, 95% of my classes are white Scandinavians, which means that already there's questions that influence both them and me differently. At the same time, especially in the so-called popular music, most of the popular music my students listen to are transformed out of music of the African diaspora, African American music, Black music, what call we? And I'm really happy to listen to my co-panelists here, because of course a lot of the, let's say, inside knowledge, what are these songs doing, that is lost when it is when it moves over here. So I see my attempt to point my students in the directions, what should you read, so that you can get a slightly better grip on what has been lost in that movement from the US or from the South or whatever to your computer or your CD player back in back home here in Copenhagen. And it's intriguing. I mean, it's not as if we don't have political, social issues that are crucial to discuss here as well. I mean, I would say I live in a racist country, but racism in Denmark works differently than racism in the US. It has other kind of political context around it, and it cannot necessarily be translated, but we need to find our own way to deal with local problems. But I think that for me, as a musicologist and a political scientist or whatever, one of the things I can do is to sort of address that. And I mean, that's not very hard, address to say, yes, music is entertainment, but it's not only entertainment. And that speaks into the joy that you were talking about just some time ago. Yes, there's joy, but joy is actually also a political expression. I mean, dancing in the street is a political song, and trying to tell the kids, as I am not allowed to tell them, that yes, you listen to this music, you enjoy it, you dance to it, but remember, it's politics. And for example, and I'm just happy to say that in public, there's hardly any of my students writing their MA thesis or their BA thesis about hip hop that is not reading Dr. Bradley now, meaning that they get more knowledge that they can use here in Denmark, even if they have never been to the South, even if there's stuff they don't understand, they actually understand that there's stuff they don't understand, which is already a victory for me as a teacher.
Oh, now, Erik, don't make me kick my foot. Thank you.
I'm sure there will be even more of them now with your book coming out, just to make you a bit more nervous.
Come on, girl, you better be international.
That's actually wonderful. Like kudos. So we have a couple of questions and from the panel, from the audience that actually work and kind of mix into my questions that I have here. And the next one, because I'm doing a couple things at once. As a panel, your scholarship includes Outkast, Janelle Monáe, Jimi Hendrix, Sun Ra, Erykah Badu, just to name a few. What makes their sound Afrofuturistic? And with groups like LaBelle and Earth, Wind and Fire, John and Alice Coltrane, would they also be included in that?
You wouldn't have Janelle Monáe without LaBelle. That's the immediate answer. But I mean, how much time you got about Outkast?
Do a special Outkast episode just for you.
I mean, you know, it would do my heart good. But real quick, because I'm really curious to hear what the other folks have to say about their respective research. So with Outkast, I think it's important for two things. One, Outkast is futuristic in their sounds because of their ability to sample the past using the funk aesthetic to think about the future. So in particular, I'm thinking about ATLiens, their second album that came out in 1996. They had been rejected by all of hip hop at the Source Awards the year before that. So they were like, you don't want us in New York. I mean, it wasn't necessarily the West Coast, but they were basically like, you don't want us nowhere, you know, forget it. We're going to space. You know what I'm saying? And how do we think about the future in space? Let's pull on this funk aesthetic that is the foundation for how we think about our Southernness and Southern Black music. And then interestingly, what happens is that they take this idea of Afrofuturism and sound and create worlds. So you get from Southern Playalistic, which is, you know, the idea that Atlanta is a hip hop city, to Stankonia in 2000, which is a completely new world, because on Aquemini at the end of the album, they were like, the world ended. And what survived the apocalypse? Southern rap. In particular, their Southern rap. So you get this new introduction to Stankonia, which leads to Speaker Box and the Love Below. But all of that to say, I mean, I think what makes their sound distinctively Afrofuturistic is their ability and willingness to continue to evolve and think about their sound and how they think Southernness is sounded, from initial funk aesthetics to pulling from electronic music to those earlier inclinations of trap. All of those things kind of pull together what Outkast does to make their sound so unique and Southern and futuristic. So.
I mean, I think that one of the things that we often we should think about when we think about Afrofuturist sound is that it's rooted in a critical geography that is inhabited by Black people. So the way that you understand that, like, yeah, jazz, blues, soul, funk, all of that, you can trace that physically to Black spaces and cataloging a series of critical interventions in the way society operates, right? Like, you could think about them as these people as cataloging, you know, like they're telling the story of how Black people or people on the outside or the margins are going like, this isn't right. Right. And like, it's only accelerated. If you think about it as a movement, it's like been rolling for forever, and it's accelerated in the 20th century because hip hop is, I would argue, technically and content wise, an even sharper critique versus like the blues and jazz, which is also a critique, right? Like, you can think about them as being critical. So like the critical geography of sound can be traced through like a LaBelle or like an Earth, Wind and Fire, because they are cataloging new thoughts that are articulated by people of color, often diasporically, right? Like they are looping in like beats that you can trace through the islands or back to Africa and things like that. So it's, the sounds themselves are a kind of a toolkit that you can sort of like point to, be like, well, this is this and this is this and this is this. It's both instruction, but it's also almost like software, like, you know, and the fact that it gets remixed, of course, again, so it points to like the acceleration of like the technical innovation, right? And in hip hop in particular, I think the fact that they're creating something out of silences, like the pauses and things like that, also really, really speak to this idea. But like the system itself is a Black system that's rooted in a critical Black geography, right?
I also think it's interesting to think about different perspectives, different priorities within this mass of music we can call Afrofuturist. Something more political, something more spiritual, something more historically, and see what are the layers that connect different musicians. And I'm thinking, for example, Alice Coltrane, the movement from the churches in Detroit playing jazz into playing a music that sounds almost Indian, made in an ashram in California, but still being within a spiritual space that sort of, I would say, as not much of a believer, as a kind of a remix of different spiritual layers into a music that points both to a distant past and a distant future. I think that is what a lot of Alice Coltrane's music is doing. And as for Janelle Monáe, and you could mention Sun Ra and quite a few others, there's also these addresses where you have good old-fashioned concept album, but that concept album is embedded in what we now call Afrofuturism, embedded in Black speculative thinking, and she's introducing that into both the narratives on the album, together with liner notes and everything, but also into everyday life. I mean, back in the days, 6-7 years ago, whenever Janelle Monáe was on television, you weren't really to be sure whether she was the android her or her real self, because she was playing with that game of being double. And now when you see her in the last couple of years entering into concrete political discussions and so on, she makes it clear that art, music, is never art, it's also an intervention in life. It's a call out for following political processes. It's a call out to the future of queers. There's so many layers in here, and for me, just trying to be systematic when I try to be a scholar, I need to distinguish between those different layers. But one of the fun things about it is that all of this is in one big entity of art and film and music and everything, which is why, to answer all the questions we are dealing with now, it's the conversations, it's the listening, it's as Paul was saying, shut up and listen as scholars as well, listen to what the practitioners, listen to what the musicians are doing. I, for my sake, as a Scandinavian, need to listen to what my fellow scholars know much better than me and try to adapt to my own prejudices and biases as a scholar, and try to sort of see, okay, it's not necessarily that everything I learned in school was wrong, but everything I learned had a certain bias and it could be done differently, and helping to ask the right questions. I mean, it's so much more important, to me at least, to ask the right questions rather than coming up with the right answers. But that also, of course, tells all of you that I'm in a really privileged position that can sit here in Scandinavia and say, well, I'm just asking questions and you need to find the answers, because that's not how life works for a lot of the people for whom this art is crucial and life-saving. So again, I will shut up and listen now, because I'm sure I will learn something.
I think I'll say that, Clarissa, all the people that you mentioned are all people that are on my playlist, and probably some other ones. I think that one of the things I think about in terms of sort of the music too, is that it's not just a place for scholarship for me, but it's also just a place to remember. It's a place, like Regina was saying, just to have joy, right? Especially when I think about Earth, Wind, and Fire. They're like my mom's favorite band. I can't even tell you how many Earth, Wind, and Fire concerts that woman has been to. I can't tell you how many she took me to. Who takes their 4-year-old to an Earth, Wind, and Fire concert? My mama. And my dad went along with her. She got her husband to pack up the babies, and we going to an Earth, Wind, and Fire concert because that's what's happening today, right? And so for me, it's also like a comfort of home, right? and that the sound of them is like, especially like I'm thinking now, like it's Saturday morning, it's 10:30 here where I am in Houston, and 10:30 in the morning at home when I was a kid on a Saturday was Earth, Wind and Fire and Smurf cartoons. Now, think about what that is as a sound, right? Earth, Wind and Fire in the background and Smurfs on TV. Is there any wonder that I study Black future space, right? Like, and communication, like, come on, y'all, right? But that to me is still, it's still just that, like, still that tactile, you know, moment, the smell of biscuits, right? And around 11, when my mom moved into the second set of Earth, Wind and Fire, the vacuum cleaner, right? Like these things all go together in my mind, especially on a Saturday morning. And I think that there's something, like Erik was saying, there's also a practicality to the way that this music lives, right? That it lived in the past, that it lives in the present, that it lives in the future. And when, especially now in the pandemic, when I haven't been home in over a year or almost a year now, right? Which is not normal for me at all in any way. You know, a couple of months ago, I started Saturday morning, like around now, I actually would be turning on my Earth, Wind and Fire playlist, right? Just because I miss home. And my biscuits are not as good as my mama's, but you know what? I try, damn it. And so I think that that's something about this, especially the music, that's just about, like I said, it's just about the way that we live at home, right? That we live in community, that allows us to really think about the future and the freedom of Black future that gives us home space to be in.
You know, I was also thinking about songs that, you know, earlier we were talking about the world as a ghetto. And I was thinking about how younger people engage with, I mean, it's amazing how to talk about hip hop as being intergenerational. And, you know, I'm like, wow, this music has been around for a while. And, but I think of how, you know, I think of Edward Said's beautiful idea of traveling theory, and how people, you know, oppressed people will take an idea or a sound or a poem and then work with it and change the meanings. I think, I mean, there's so many examples. One example that comes to mind is Public Enemy's By the Time I Get to Arizona, which was composed during, you know, a specific historical moment, you know, as a protest against a state which was trying to ban or trying to hold out against a holiday for MLK. But then many years later now, the song has been changed. And now it's a song about protesting against anti-immigrant racism and protesting against the wall, right? And the ways in which both, you know, Chuck D and Public Enemy changed the song, but not again as these kind of composers living in a vacuum, but in response to the people listening to their music, and especially newer generation, you know, multiracial, multilingual generation, you know, taking that and really transforming it into, you know, possibilities of liberation and solidarity.
Clarissa, I think we got a question on this end. If I can kind of jump in and ask it, and then open it up for anybody here that might have another question. I was actually writing down questions that came to my mind as you all were talking, and in the context of you all talking, they all kind of sort of been answered in one way or another. So this is really great. You know, I teach humanities at Seminole State College, and one of the things I like to do is to give them things from the past so that they can make correlations to things that are going on now, so that they can see themselves or our culture as a historical continuum. And I'm always struck by, for instance, when I give them the letter from the Birmingham jail, I am so struck by how many students recognize some of the same rhetoric that King was using in that and what's going on now in our political unrest. And the refrain that I get from them is, why is this still going on? You know, they're just now learning about the letter from the Birmingham Gym, some of them. They didn't get it in public school, at least not here in Florida. And they're learning something new that's really from the past. And I go back to Dr. Taylor's that, you know, past, future, present, future conversation we had yesterday. Them learning about something in the past helps them to understand what's going on here in the present. So now my question for all of the talk that we're doing about Afrofuturism, and we know it's hard to define it, you know, my question would be, you know, sort of based on what Dr. Bradley said about, you know, being immersed in the music and growing up in the music and being part of the music. And also what Dr. Ortiz was talking about in terms of our society not working. And our young people know it's not working. They may not know why it's not working, but they know it's not working. And so if Afrofuturism or this concept or this paradigm or this idea, whatever we want to call it, if it could provide a map to that kind of liberation of freedom, and when I say liberation of freedom, I'm talking about psychological freedom, creative freedom, emotional freedom, and even physical freedom. If it were to provide a map, what would that map look like so that someone who is enjoying the music of a Janelle Monáe and not making the connections will see this and go, wow, I may use this music as an escape, but this escape really is a map. What would that map look like from an Afrofuturistic paradigmic perspective?
I think that that paradigm would be one that would be built on anti-oppressive practices, right? So if you think about the sound of Afrofuturism, there's a lot of emphasis on love, there's a lot of emphasis on the spirit. So I think that would be one part of the paradigm. You know, what do you need to do to make society less oppressive? And by extension, then that becomes a question of, you know, gender equity. Like how do you protect children? How do you protect women? How do you protect the other, whatever the other is, you know, so LGBTQ things. I think it becomes a question of a spiritualism of a sort. You know, I think one of the things about quote unquote on modernity is that religion is often almost like a blunt instrument in the hands of some. And so a spiritual practice that is centered on care, centered on renewal, these become really another part of the kind of pattern of in the paradigm of Afrofuturism, right? A celebration of the ancestors, celebration and protection of sort of knowledge and culture, and reverence for spaces that are nurtured by, you know, by culture, things like that. I think that emphasis on equity, that emphasis on care, becomes a way to understand systems that work and systems that don't work, right? Like I think one of the things about the sound of Afrofuturism, and you know, and you think about this in the context of Hurston, what is Hurston's sort of oral history work? What does Hurston's sort of folk work do? It tells you from the perspective of the worker how the system is, and the system don't work. So if you listen to Hurston's work, you know, listen to the story she collected, then you get a pretty strong sense of like, well, I'd change this if I had a chance. So I think like the paradigms that are offered up in Afrofuturism across the spaces of Afrofuturism sort of offers is a kind of consistency around these questions of hierarchy, these questions of equity, these questions of protection.
Thank you.
You know, what I was thinking of ways that, we've been talking about listening, but, we are, all of us teachers, I think everyone, we're all educators, let's face it, we're all trying to like teach an alternative reality right now. And I was thinking about how we can encourage people, younger people, whoever, even to read texts and music which isn't African-centered, and find liberatory aspects of that literature, and to kind of tease out. What I mean by this is that I was rereading some of C.L.R. James's correspondence and writings about how he became a revolutionary in the 1930s, starting in Trinidad, going to the metropole, the so-called mother country, the colonizer, and London and Brixton and all those places. And James talks about growing up in this heavily controlled and policed colonial society in Trinidad, but he talks about reading Charles Dickens, and he says one of the things that my generation of people who became so pivotal in the anti-colonial global struggle was that when we read Dickens, and then when we went to the metropole, whether it was Paris or Brussels or London or Madrid, and we got to these places that had been tyrannizing us for so long, and we had these writers in our minds. And he talks about Dickens, there are many others, but he said, I got to London in the Great Depression, 1930s, and I'm looking around and I'm thinking, wow, this society is no better than it was when Dickens was writing, David Copperfield and Great Expectations and et cetera and et cetera. And he said Dickens was, and even Thackeray were people who taught us about why revolution was needed, because this society a century later wasn't able to solve its own contradictions. And he said, and he would, people would say, who did he get inspired by? Charles Dickens? Thackeray? Really? And he'd say, yeah. He said, because we learn how to read this as an example of why the empire worked, what we were supposed to aspire to, but would never get to the level of a Charles Dickens. And then we get to London in the 1930s, and we realize, wow, this society is just as downtrodden as it was back in a tale, back in A Christmas Carol. My gosh. So I'm kind of thinking out loud now about how we encourage people to read even those quote unquote mainstream texts and find alternative possibilities, using the tools that we're learning and teaching in Afrofuturism. The last thing I mentioned too is that I came across a quote, because I'm supposed to give a talk about Dickens someplace in the next few weeks. I better get caught up. But there's this quote, and it was by a Soviet dissident from the 50s or for the 40s and 50s during Stalinism, and he was saying, for those of us fighting that system of Stalinism, Charles Dickens was more real than Joseph Stalin, or became more real, because we found a refuge right within this literature, in the same way that we know that dissidents all over the world find a sanctuary in Black music, really from the 19th and early 20th century forward.
Okay, we are coming up on the hour, and I have, because instructors, you're always a teacher at heart. So I had about 15 or so questions, and clearly we're not getting to all of those, but I have tried to field some of the questions from the audience and combine them with some of the questions I had already created. And there's one I think that I think everyone would be interested in hearing your response. I recently read a description of the science that went into Grandmaster Flash's creation of his sound. Can you speak to the scientific elements, technological advancements that comprise the sound, and how it can be hijacked with, Paul mentioned earlier, the alt-right and this misinformation and the notion that these platforms that can inform and help grow sound or the creation thereof, how those two can maybe counteract each other. It's hard to create when you're not sure if the information you're being fed is accurate or not. And then someone mentioned the pandemic, and so how do you see all of this playing out in a decade or so in terms of the sound of Afrofuturism? So I know that's a lot. It's a lot of, so you know, you can pick parts that you feel you want to respond.
I mean, I can't speak to the science. That is definitely not my ministry. But
it was intense. I'll say that. It was intense. I read that and I had no idea he went through all that.
No, I mean, I believe it. Like, I believe that, you know, there's actual technicality to it. I'm just not the one to speak on it with my literary background. But I mean, I think the interesting about the pandemic and thinking about Afrofuturism is I can't help but think about Octavia Butler and the surge of renewed interest in her parable series and what that looks like. And one of the things that I'm actually thinking about possibly in the fall is with students is to do a sonic reading of the parable series because there's a lot of reference to sound. And it could be, you know, and just the anarchy of sound, even, you know, because of the anarchy of the actual book plot itself. I'm wondering how creatives are going to take that and make it their own to speak to the pandemic, because I feel like the forced silence of the pandemic of it all, right? Like on the one hand, you have the folks who are in the mask, and that's muffling your actual how you engage with other people. You could think about like the politicization of silence in terms of politicians, you know, and the folks who are like, oh well, we don't need to do this because we're almost through it. I know somebody somewhere is probably working on something about like what the vaccine might sound like when it punctures the bottle and punctures the skin. And I mean, like there's so many different ways, but I think it goes back to what we've been kind of saying, the duration of this conversation is that sound is more than the music. Like I'm thinking about, you know, sonically, what are the sounds of the pandemic outside of the music? You know what I'm saying? The quiet, you know what I'm saying? The quiet of a room where somebody just passed from COVID. You know what I'm saying? It's dreary, but that's still sonic. You know what I'm saying? The wail of somebody who can't attend a funeral because it's not socially, there's no social distancing. Like I think that the idea of sounding grief is going to be the significant takeaway from the pandemic as a sonic trauma, right? Especially for those of us, you know, where mourning is a whole thing. Like in the South, you know what I mean? It's a whole process. It's not just, I'm sorry for your loss. You know, the people got to come over. They got to bring the whole menu of KFC. They got to bring the sodas and the waters. You know what I'm saying? You have to go through it's a whole process. And that whole process has been pushed to the side because it's not safe. You know what I mean? And then on top of that, the folks who are willing to you know, risk it all, so to speak. You know what I'm saying? But I'm really thinking in particular about the way that we mourn and how that has significantly changed. And a lot of that also is part of sound. You know what I'm saying? Like you have folks who are live streaming funerals because they can't attend in person, right? Like how does that impact how we think about sound, right? And wailing and letting it go. So yeah, I think that we're entering a very Octavia Butler-esque moment of reflection. And it's something that it's going to take us a long time to get over. And then on top of that, it was a pandemic during the age of Trump. There's no way that you can get out of that unscathed. You know what I mean? So just trying to figure out how to think through the multiple levels of grieving that have affected us, and using sound is one of the way to do that. I think is definitely a productive way to work through that trauma.
And I think about like sort of in that same space, Regina, of the sound. My mom was a deaconess and my dad was a deacon. And so in our church growing up, and I grew up in the second oldest Black church in San Jose, California, right? And so I also think about like the history of and the social responsibility of those old churches in mourning loss, right? No matter who you were in the community, you mattered to them because you mattered to us because you were ours, right? I don't care if you were a politician or a doctor or a janitor or a street cleaner or a dog catcher, anything in between. The sort of cultural system of how we celebrated your life and grieved your loss was the same, right? But I think about the first time I heard somebody say they were going to live stream a funeral, I was like, yeah, but you're not going to get the sound of the usher tapping somebody on the knee, asking them to move over. Like, do you know what that means to me? Like, you have to be able to have those kind of sounds, those kind of moments, right? The whispers of the people who are talking about somebody's outside children, which was a concept I did not understand until I was an adult. Are the children outside?
Fighting over the funeral programs. That's very much, it's a thing. Mm-hmm.
It's a thing. And I think about, the seriousness. And I think that one of the things that we're going to start to see later, probably as academics and different types of academics are welcome into the academy and into the system, right? As we go to Paul's point about the youth recognizing that it's broken, right? The babies know it ain't right, right? And so, but as they also are welcomed into this space because we're already here, right? Those of us on this panel are already here, and we're saying to them, no, you can come in this space and break it up too. Like, let's redo it, right? The thing I think about is something I saw somebody post on Twitter, and God love Black academic Uncle Twitter late at night, because somebody posted about how like it's gonna be a whole, like they can't wait to sit on a dissertation about Zoom funerals and Black space. And I was like, a who and a what? And I'm like, also, yeah, I'm totally here for that. I want to know about that. Theorize that for me, right? Because we know what was lost, right? And we know what won't ever come back. And we know what that means, right? And I think especially for Black folks throughout the diaspora, but particularly in the US, we know what it means to lose moments of mourning for our dead, right? Because that's happened to us in various moments, right? It happened in the early 20th century when people were lynched. It happened during slavery, right? We lost our moments of mourning for our dead. And now we're back. And there's something about this that feels very like, I can't believe this is still happening, right? But there's also something about it that I've seen people talk about, instead of, having to come up with a collection for the headstone, coming up with a collection for that wide Zoom so that we could, Zoom the funeral for the people who can't come, right? And there's something about that, what that means, I think, as terms of conversation, but also in terms of sound, that we're gonna see in 20 years. And we're gonna have a language for it then, I think.
I think that the question of technology is a interesting one. We can think about Afrofuturism and tech as a system of, and a way of seeing, but there is in that a kind of black reality whereby Black people are in a system that's unfair and they're always seeking to hack that system. So when you think about this in terms of, in particular, like, you know, hip hop and rap, there's a direct intervention in what is quote unquote the established way something is supposed to happen, and then what happens in hip hop. And those interventions are around sometimes the quote unquote misuse of something, the turntable. You're supposed to let it spin. I'm not gonna let it spin. I'm gonna do this. And then I'm gonna build a whole sort of like language and technique around that intervention. And then that in itself will become its own sort of like knowledge base, right? Like it becomes its own language. And it's a counter public, right? It's a deliberate intervention by the person of color to a system that has been articulated by the dominant system. And so they're creating space in the system that they recognize that they don't belong in, right? So the intervention there technically is, you know, you're at some very little sense breaking it. Like it is not functioning as designed, but the functionality that Black people created delivers on their intention of like voicing their point of view. So it's a hack, right? Like you can think of it as like an established system being hacked. And I think, you know, we can look at that historically as something Black people do a lot, right? Like they're hacking a system that is unfair to try to create more fairness. And so from a problem solving standpoint, it's like a critical thinking skill. Like they are deeply engaged in a system that's unfair. They have critically looked at it and gone, I'm gonna do this for my own reasons, right? You think of it as like project-based learning, right? Like this project is not good. I'm gonna come up with a different outcome. So we shouldn't think of it as like something that people can't do. In fact, it's something that like Black people have a long history of doing. And the tools of the moment are the tools that are oppressing people. So those are the tools that get hacked, right? So like, don't overthink the science, I would say, right? Just think about the practice of, you know, creating space for a more liberatory framework.
Okay, probably this may be the last question, depending on how you answer. And I'm hoping it's something that everyone can provide a response to. Erik spoke yesterday about music having work, that music has something to do, a job to do, and that it's highly meaningful for the people who engaged in them. What is, in your opinion, the work then of the sound of Afrofuturism? And what does it, or what must it do moving forward?
I think the work is for sound to be a genealogy of multiple Black experiences. And a genealogy is just that. I mean, like the work is recognition, but it's also making space for the future to come clear, right? And I think that's, you know, and I think the additional challenge of thinking about it as work is who gets to do the work, right? I think one of my biggest concerns about not just Afrofuturism, but just about Black cultural studies and Black culture in general is that you have folks who are pushing out the actual creators. You have, because, oh, I've studied it, so I'm the expert, you know what I'm saying? And I'm like, no, you're a guest, like you're a visitor in this space, you know what I'm saying? And I think with Afrofuturism, there's always a recognition that folks are visitors. This is one, because of the fluidity of it. Like it's not just gonna stay the same. What Afrofuturism meant in the 90s is different than what it means now. It's gonna be different than what it means post-pandemic, you know what I'm saying? Because we're technically living in an Afrofuturist moment. but I also think that the need to make space for those who create, make space for those who exist in these spaces and only exist in these spaces, in order to push forward the possibility of futurity is the biggest labor that folks have who are conducting the work.
Yeah, I think that for me, I see to Regina's point, who gets to do the work, but also what's the value that's placed on the work, right? Like, it's not just that I also share your concern, Regina, that people are going to come in here, you know, talking about, well, I wrote a dissertation and therefore, and I'm like, if you don't push, I will trip you on a BART rail. Like, go away. But it's also about, because this is the thing that I was saying. I'm gonna call for our friend Ronaldo Anderson. He and I were talking a couple of weeks ago about, like, on some level, some of us are gonna also have to take ownership of this work and call it work, right? And make it legible to places that pay us, right? Because work is also about compensation. And so we have to also call it work, we have to own it as our work, and we have to own it as compensatable work. Because if we don't, then somebody else will, and you know, they'll get twice as much money, and all they did was write a dissertation about it. Like, it has no deeper tactile, you know, past or future or present meaning beyond what can be found on a library bookshelf, right? And I think that's the thing that for me that I see in really being able to talk about the meaning of work is also expanding that, right? Like, I love when I see folks who make up, you know, and create words and memes and moments in social media. And then when hotel chains or, you know, whatever come up and use their stuff, and they're like, yeah, I copywrote that. So, and I can't think of, you know, the man with the car dealership ad, you know.
Oh, the money reside guy.
The money resides, thank you. When I read an article saying that he copywrote that, I was like, yes, baby, yes, right? Because that's work. That's recognizing that your work has value in a corporate and in a capitalist system that is always gonna make work of Blackness, that is always gonna make capital on Blackness. And so if the system is already set up to do that, I'm not gonna be broke. Like, this is just not what's gonna occur here anymore. I'm over it. Like, and so I think that that's what we need to do now, right? In sort of an Afrofuturist moment, is say that we have capital here, right? We've always had capital here, and own our work and make our work for us.
I'm interested in, I mean, I appreciate what you've been saying as well, but I'm interested in the work that the music is doing, not necessarily the musicians, but the music. And I think, as I see it, at least from my perspective, one of the things the music cannot give up on is some kind of hope, some kind of futurity, some kind of utopianness, some kind of liberatory practices. If that is removed, I'm not quite sure. Then I think we will actually need some other words to discuss it, because I think that's so part of what discussing Afrofuturism and music has been about. But I appreciate Regina's comment that the 90s are different than now. I mean, it's always nice to be reminded that you're getting older. But I think that one of the things that I am not happy about the 90s is that in what came to be Afrofuturist discourse is that it was so much hung up on three genius men and so much hung up on one tiny linearity, which is about to become the canon now. And it was the kind of avant-garde Black music, which is music I love, but I think along the way, one might have forgotten other musical genres. One might have forgotten what is the Afrofuturism of more mainstream music, whatever that is, how to be Afrofuturist in minor genres, in genres dominated by female musicians rather than male musicians, and so on, and sort of simply expand the archive as well as moving forward, I think is what we need to do in the coming years.
Yeah, I think the work of the sound is almost the work of code, right? Like it's a way to program the machine. And I think that's one of the things that makes it really important.
As the hour has come, we want to thank everyone for participating and attending. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for your response and your scholarship at such an hour on a Saturday. We do know it is not always so easy to just pop up and be engaging and intelligent when maybe you prefer still being under the covers. We would also like to remind you all that through December 31st, 2021, the Hurston Museum will have an exhibition, A Past Unremembered, a Black Speculative Odyssey and Afrofuturism, Mapping the Sonic Imagination, which includes a playlist along with a written catalog and extensive bibliography. Again, we thank you all for coming, and I will turn this back over to Dr. French.
Thank you all. I wanted to plug the session at 1:30. We're going to take a lunch break now, but please come back at 1:30. Paul Ortiz will be speaking on oral history, Zora Neale Hurston, and the Black freedom struggle through storytelling and song. So please come and join us then. Thank you again. Great morning. Thank you all.